What is going on, YouTube? Andrew Miller from OakhamHeadlines.com coming back at y'all today with our Texas-Wyoming preview. We're taking a little bit of a different approach to this preview than past videos. This will be starting with the Wyoming game and then going for the rest of the football season. But before I get into talking about the format of this video, I just want to talk about some of the game notes for Wyoming, Texas this weekend. Texas takes on Wyoming. It'll be Texas's first game back at DKR since pulling off the upset of number 3 ranked Alabama on the road in Tuscaloosa last weekend, 34-24. Texas kicks against Wyoming at 7 p.m. Central Time at DKR. The game, game is broadcast live on Longhorn Network. As far as I know right now, it is the only game that is broadcast on Longhorn Network this year, at least that has been announced. There are 3 possibilities remaining for Longhorn Network this season, but we don't need to dive too deep into that. Texas comes in record of 2-0. They beat Rice in the season opener, and then as I mentioned before, Alabama last weekend beat Rice 37-10. It was on September 2nd. Wyoming comes into this game 2-0 record, 0-0 in the Mountain West. This is Wyoming's first true road game of the season. So far, they beat Texas Tech at home in overtime. That was on September 2nd, 35-33. Very exciting game, and obviously kicked off Tech's tough 0-2 start to the season. And then they beat FCS Portland State last weekend, 31-17. Portland State team that played a lot closer game against an FBS foe in week 2 because they got beat. It was some mauling like 81-7 against Oregon in week 1. Anyway, want to kind of talk about the format of this video and what we're going to kind of be doing moving forward. I'll still have like the kind of panel discussions with Tarek and Shane, but for the deep dive previews, I'm going to try a little bit more of this new format. I'm going to cover some of the team notes for Wyoming, what their offense, defense, their coordinators, all that looks like, some of the team tendencies, the starters, really just dive into what Wyoming is and does as a team. And then, talk about kind of more of like the statistic or like some of the analytics, statistics behind it, put a little bit more of a data backing like I like to do on the channel and on the website. And then why I think Texas will ultimately win this game, as well as some more info on the matchup a little bit later on. So I'll start, it'll be like a preview just to get to know the players for Wyoming a little bit better, some of the key players on the 2 deep, obviously the starters, the coordinators, and the head coach. In a way, kind of provide a background preview like you would see in like a Texas Homer video or something like that. And then try to dive in a little bit more into the context, numbers, like I said, analytics, statistics, things like that. So let's go ahead and get started here. So Wyoming is led by 10th year head coach Craig Bull. He's been at Wyoming more than, I would say, like 90-95% of FBS head coaches. Been at their schools. He only has had 1 losing season at Wyoming since 2016, has found a fair amount of success there. They've been one of the more consistent programs, at least like making bowl games in the Mountain West, but they've had a hard time kind of reaching that peak. He's only had an 8-win season there. That is his max. Wyoming is off to a good start this season, though. They'll be looking to see if they can contend more in the Mountain West. They were picked to finish 6th in the Mountain West in the preseason poll. And then no votes in the AP Polar Coaches poll for the top 25 to start the season. Back to some about Craig Bull. So he's got over 3 decades of coaching experience. He's one that kind of stems from the Tom Osborne coaching tree. He was a longtime assistant at Nebraska in the 1990s, started as a GA there in the early 1980s. A lot of his experience came at Nebraska. He returned to Nebraska as the LB coach from 1995 to 2002. He was also defensive coordinator, received that promotion, that job title from 2000 through 2002. Helped Osborne and the Huskers win multiple national championships there, I believe 1995 and 1997. Bull then parlayed that success, took the head coaching job at FCS North Dakota State. He took that position, I believe it was starting in 2003. Really built up that program there. Ended up winning a lot of games, and then before he left for the Wyoming job in 2014, he won 3 straight national championships at North Dakota State from 2011 to 2013. He preceded current Kansas State head coach Chris Kleiman as the head coach at North Dakota State. As I mentioned earlier, Bull has led Wyoming to one of the more consistent eras in the football program's history. I believe they made bowl games in 5 of the last 7 years. One of those years they did go 6-6. I don't remember why they didn't make a bowl game that year, but only one losing season in that span. That was in, I believe, 2020. So you kind of put an asterisk by that. But Wyoming has struggled against P5 opponents during this span. Under bowl 2-9 since 2014, but they have found a little bit more success here lately against P5 opponents. They are 2-1 in the last 2 seasons against teams from the P5. That includes wins over Texas Tech and Missouri. I mentioned earlier, Wyoming picked to finish 6th out of 12 teams in the preseason Mountain West poll. They do have 5 preseason All-Mountain West Conference team selections, including Defensive Player of the Year, Easton Gibbs. He's kind of the leader linebacker for Wyoming on their defense. Similar in a way to Jalen Ford, Texas saw Ford get the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year honors this preseason. As a program, Wyoming and Craig Bohl, they rely very heavily on developing and returning players, making the most of talent evaluation and culture fit. They have struggled to recruit at a high level, and I'd say throughout the last decade. They rank 125th in Division I in college team talent in the 247 Sports Team Talent Composite. That is behind 2 FCS schools, but pretty much every year they outperform their recruiting talent rankings in the ESPN S&P Plus rankings. They have outperformed their college team talent rankings in the 24/7 Sports Composite by at least 20 spots. So as expected, with them having a bunch of classes outside of the top 100 in the nation in the 247 Sports Composite since 2019, they've again way outperformed expectations. With Wyoming, focusing so much on talent evaluation, scheme and culture fit, staple of the team is obviously player development. Wyoming has, on both sides of the ball, developed talent at a very high level. They produced 11 draft picks, NFL draft picks since 2019, including obviously Bills quarterback Josh Allen. They also have a few other starters in the NFL in the current day. Bengals starting linebacker Logan Wilson and Raiders starting safety former Philadelphia Eagle Marcus Epps are a few of those highlights among their NFL players and starters. So I want to cover some of the transfer portal for Wyoming because they saw a lot of turnover during the offseason, mostly by way of departures. They were one of the teams that suffered in terms of quantity and lost production, a lot of talent and players to the portal. 16 outgoing players, and they only brought in, I believe they only brought in 3 incoming transfers. So obviously heavy losses there. That's around 3,600 snaps that Wyoming lost from outgoing transfers from their 2022 squad. Of those, they lost their highest rated recruit in program history as 4-star offensive lineman Deshaun Woods. They also lost their leading receiver, Joshua Cobbs, number 2 sack leader, I believe it's Olawasi Omotasho. Excuse me for butchering his name there, but he was number 2 in sacks for them last season. Second highest graded starting offensive lineman, interior offensive lineman Manuel Pregnon. I believe he transferred to USC. And then also their leading returner and leading rusher, Titus Swen was their leading rusher last season. He was a 1,000-yard rusher, but he was kicked off the team, I believe, last winter, late last fall, and then ultimately decided to enter the transfer portal. Speaking of the transfer portal, obviously a storyline of note in this game is Texas wide receiver Isaiah Nayor. Nayor transferred from Wyoming to Texas a couple of years ago. He was Wyoming's, I believe, their most productive wide receiver during the 2021 season. But Wyoming keeps finding ways to replace a lot of these guys just with internal development and, again, talent evaluation. They only added 3 portal commits during the offseason, one of which is former Northern Illinois running back Harrison, I think it's Wiley, who led the Huskies in rushing yards last season. He's out for the season with a knee injury, suffered a season-ending knee injury early in fall camp in early August. Wyoming's other 2 portal additions are both wideouts. One was Holy Cross starter Ayer Asante. He has contributed here and there for Wyoming so far this season. The other one is Vanderbilt redshirt sophomore Devin Body. Limited contributions at Vanderbilt last year, but both guys that are kind of getting rotational reps at Wyoming this season. Let's go ahead and get into talking about each side of the ball for Wyoming. We'll start on the defense. So on defense, Wyoming is led by 4th-year defensive coordinator Jay Sawville. Similar to Craig Bohl, Sawville is a guy with a lot of coaching experience at the collegiate level, nearly 30 years at this point. He was previously defensive coordinator for Minnesota and Wake Forest, Minnesota under Jerry Kill, and at Wake Forest under Dave Clawson. Under Sawville, Wyoming's defense has been pretty steady and successful. They've ranked in the top 50 in scoring defense in each of Sawville's 3 years at the helm. It's, I think, a little bit thanks to Wyoming's just kind of slower pace of play, but they have had one of the better defenses in the Mountain West the last few years. They had a top 10 defense in terms of adjusted efficiency in 2020, but ironically, even though the team got better, the defense kind of slipped up. They've ranked no better than 88th in the FBS in adjusted defensive efficiency the last 2 seasons. They've kind of struggled to defend the run in 2021 and 2022, allowed over 4 yards per carry, which is kind of out of character for Craig Bowl teams that really try to sell out and stop the run on defense. They've kind of turned the corner on that this season. They've allowed, I believe it's around 2.5 yards per carry through the first 2 games this year, largely thanks to a very experienced defensive front that they returned, I believe, almost all their starters, but returned 10 starters in total on the defensive side of the ball. So just as a whole, a very experienced defense. But they like to play a really physical brand of football up front, like to get hats to the football. I mentioned earlier, kind of sell out to stop the run first. They play like a base 4-3 Tampa 2 defense. Tampa 2 kind of made infamous by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, head coach Tony Dungy in the early 2000s. They play 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, sometimes 3 depending on how many they line up in the box, and then 4 defensive backs, 2 safeties, 2 corners, and a nickel back. In coverage, they mostly utilize cover 1 or cover 3 defenses on about 55% of plays in pass defense in their 2 games this season. In terms of the safety looks, they do like to play 2 high safety, but those safeties will move around a lot of times to help, kind of condense the field and get more guys up closer to the line of scrimmage. Again, all back to that point of helping out to stop the run. They also do play some man coverage, especially one-on-one on the outside. It's kind of a 50-50 split between man and zone coverage. As I mentioned before, the safeties can play aggressive. A lot of times they do like to get the safeties within 6 or 8 yards of the line of scrimmage, or even into the box to help in the pass rush or run defense. If it's an obvious passing down, though, like 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9 situations, they will often keep two high safeties to keep the play in front of them. Sawville's defense, I mentioned earlier, they're known to load the box, pressure the quarterback, most commonly with 5 or 6 man pressures the last few seasons, but they're only rushing at least 5 on 20% of plays this season, so kind of been working to stop the pass a little bit more. I think a lot of that is due to Tech spreading them out, playing a lot of 4 wide 2 weeks ago in the opener. Wyoming does disguise really well with a lot of 4 down fronts. They send a lot of linebackers on different twists and stunts, especially on 3rd downs. They do play a 4-man front, so they have a bunch of 1-gappers, but they're going to try to use a lot of different experienced guys. They got some guys that are pretty rangy and have a lot of defensive snaps under their belt, especially the linebacker position and along the defensive line. They can get to the quarterback. They do tend to be effective when they send heavier pressure. Almost all of their quarterback pressures, or I believe it's all 7 of their blitz plays this year where they've sent more than 5 pass rushers have resulted in quarterback pressures. 3 of those have resulted in sacks. As a whole, Wyoming is a sure tackling group. They've got a lot of experience. They don't miss a lot of tackles. They rank in the top 3 in tackling grade in the Mountain West so far this season. And then they're just very experienced almost at all levels of the defense. They do rank 4th in the Mountain West. Like I said, a sure tackling bunch. So they rank 4th in the Mountain West, allowing a missed and broken tackle rate of 9.8%. They're one of, I believe it's about a dozen group of 5 programs that have a missed and broken tackle rate in the single digits. It is worth noting that they loaded the box more often last weekend against Portland State than they did in week 1 against Texas Tech. So I do think for Texas's matchup, you're probably going to be looking at a situation where Wyoming does load the box a little bit more infrequently. Craig Bowl mentioned in his Monday press conference that Wyoming does want to get Quinn Ewers uncomfortable and kind of get him out of his zones. And I think the way that they're going to do that is by taking away some of the easy options in the short and intermediate passing game and really force Ewers to make all the throws. And I think you're going to see a mixture of fronts for Wyoming this week as they try to kind of get in Ewer's head. And, again, they're trying to make him uncomfortable. So you might see some ghost fronts, some simulated pressures. Rice had success with that in week 1. So I think Wyoming's probably going to take a page out of their book and try a similar strategy. So that's something to watch this weekend. So let's move on here, specifically focus on Wyoming's defensive front. So they're not super deep at defensive end, but their top 3 guys do have a lot of snaps under their belts. Wyoming starters at defensive end are redshirt sophomore Sebastian Harsh and redshirt junior Devon Harris. You'll also see sophomore Braden Siders getting a lot of snaps. They have each taken over 90 defensive snaps for Wyoming this season. And get after the quarterback. Harris led the team in sacks last week, led the team in sacks last season. Braden Siders was second with 6.5. Harris had 8. Siders and Harris they've combined for 10 quarterback pressures, 3 sacks this season, so still getting after the quarterback effectively. Harsh is no slouch either. He is their highest grade pass rusher. All of Wyoming's defensive ends do tend to play majority of 5 tech, so kind of just outside the shoulder of the offensive tackle, but still lining up in that, with hand on the ground. But they do a nice job with outside contain. They're very disruptive in the pass rush. They get their hands up to bat balls. They have 3 batted balls on the season between the 3 defensive ends. I think they're a little bit better in the pass rush than they are in run defense. They really only have one guy that's been a regular contributor, at least like an above average contributor in run defense this season at defensive end. That's Devon Harris. He's the only edge player they have edge in terms of PFF classification positionally, but he's the only one in the Mountain West that ranks in the top half of players at his position in terms of grade in run defense. Harsh and Siders, they've had some issues with some missed tackles. They've combined for 4 missed tackles on the season. Some of the more elusive backs can bust runs to the outside pretty quickly. With Wyoming playing that 4-down front, those defensive ends are, they're supposed to be one gappers, be able to shed the block, get to the ball carrier, bring them down. But Harsh and Siders, they're not the biggest defensive ends, and so against some of the bigger offensive tackles, especially for tech, it can be that could be a tougher assignment to be able to shed that block and locate, identify, bring down the ball carrier. I do think, in general, Texas should be able to take advantage of the lack of depth that Wyoming has at defensive end. Texas is a team that can rotate all along the defensive line and edge. Wyoming doesn't quite have that luxury. So I think as the game wears on, you'll start to see Christian Jones, Kelvin Banks be able to wear down those Wyoming edge players, and then also be able to set the edge more effectively, blocking for the run. At defensive tackle and nose, Wyoming, they are a little bit smaller, but they do have some quick and disruptive guys, some guys that have quick feet, good hands, and they have more depth along the interior defensive line. They can rotate there a little bit more. At nose is 6'4", 290 pounds, super senior Cole Godbout. He's one of the most experienced and productive players that Wyoming has on defense. Got over 2,000 defensive snaps under his belt at Wyoming. Backing him up is 6'4", 280 pound redshirt sophomore Gavin Meyer. They do like to rotate Meyer a good bit. He's got 65 defensive snaps in the first 2 games. To put that in perspective, that's about 15, 20 more defensive snaps than we saw Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton get in the first 2 weeks for Texas along the defensive line. And obviously Collins and Broughton are 2 important guys up front for Texas. Along the interior, it knows most of what Godbout and Meyer play will be 1 tech or 2I. It's around 80% of their defensive snaps this season. So they're not lining up directly over the football, but more in traditional 4-3 defense fashion. They're still manning the A gap and, still are taking on the occasional double team, but, mostly just facing one-on-one matchups, especially when they're rushing the passer. It knows they're pretty quick and sound assignment in run defense. Both Wyoming's nose tackles grade out among the top half of interior defensive linemen in run defense in the Mountain West this season. They're productive interior pass rushers as well. Both get to the quarterback a lot, provide a lot of pressure. Godbout and Meyer, they've combined for 8 quarterback pressures this season, which is productive by nose tackle considerations. At defensive tackle, Wyoming's got two other guys they like to rotate a lot. Starting at 3 tech, 6'4", 287-pound redshirt junior. I believe it's Jordan Bertignoli. That's one of two names that I might have a little bit of trouble with here, but he's been a consistent contributor. I believe 3-year starter at Wyoming, 4 years of getting like regular reps as well. He's had at least 3 tackles for loss and over 30 combined tackles in each of his last 3 seasons at Wyoming. Led all Wyoming defensive tackles last season, had 8 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks. Bertignoli's 287-pound frame. It doesn't sound huge for defensive tackle, but again, considering most of these guys for Wyoming along the interior defensive line are under 300 pounds, that's a decent size for him. And so he's able to take on double teams pretty effectively for a 3-tech guy. He's got enough power to be able to, take on those double teams, spill out the ball carrier for, some of these active Wyoming defensive ends, linebackers to be able to clean up the play. But he's also someone that can be disruptive in and of himself. He's also able to, kind of one-gap some of the slower interior offensive linemen, break up running plays in the backfield, pressure the quarterback. I got to give him credit looking through some of the numbers. Bertignoli, he's one of the most versatile Wyoming defenders I could find. In terms of his pre-snap alignments, he's the only Wyoming defensive lineman that has a run stop this season out of the 2-2-I, and 3 technique. So they will sometimes slide him over to play closer to the center, more inside the one of the guard shoulders, and he's able to make plays pretty much wherever you line him up along the interior defensive line. Again, some of the bigger, quicker, and just larger frame interior offensive linemen, kind of like what Texas has, and guys like DJ Campbell, Cole Hudson when he's really on, and Hayden Connor, at least how he looked last weekend against Alabama, can overpower Bertignoli, and it ends up leading to situations where Wyoming isn't able to get as much of that interior pressure in the pass rush, also can have more missed tackles and missed gap assignments in run defense. The backup 3-tech for Wyoming, a little bit smaller guy, 6'1", 270-pound Ben Florentine. Florentine, I think he's got around 15, 20 defensive snaps this season, so they don't rotate as much at defensive tackle as they do at nose, but I do think for Wyoming that, if they end up getting worn down a little bit more in this game, they might have to rotate just out of necessity a little bit more, but I think Wyoming's interior defensive line can be disruptive against Ewers, but especially for Texas's ground game. I think for UT, it depends on how the interior O-line looks, or just the offensive line as a whole. If they come out looking like they did against Alabama, allowing just a few quarterback pressures and no sacks, they're obviously going to be in good shape this weekend. But if they look like they did against Rice in the season opener, Ewers is going to be having to evade the pocket a little bit more, use his legs as a weapon, and he's just going to be facing more pressure. The ground game's also going to have a tougher time getting going. So let's move on to linebacker now for Wyoming. So again, I mentioned they mostly play two linebacker fronts in the Tampa 2 defense. Their star is Mike linebacker and senior Easton Gibbs. I mentioned he was the Mountain West Conference Defensive Player of the Year, multi-time All-Mountain West selection. He's the leader of this defense. He does a lot, does a little bit of everything, it seems like, in pass coverage for a linebacker. They ask him to drop into pass coverage a lot to cover short and intermediate routes. Sometimes he does drop, 15, 20 yards downfield in coverage as well. But, he's also helping to find the ball carrier. Very instinctive guy, good at finding, locating, bringing down the ball carrier and run defense, can test space well. He's got a bigger frame. Gibbs is 6'2", 235 pounds. He's very rangy and instinctive, very experienced, very productive in his last 4 years at Wyoming. Has over 2,000 defensive snaps under his belt in his collegiate career. Last season, Gibbs led Wyoming and was second in the Mountain West in total tackles, had 121. Like I said, really, really good at finding the ball carrier, shoots the gap in the blink of an eye, ends up blowing up a lot of plays at or behind the line of scrimmage, and he led the team in run stops last season, leads all Wyoming LBs in run stuffs this season with 7 already on the season. He moves really well in coverage for a bigger middle linebacker. I've seen some of him cover crossing routes across the middle, and even deeper down the field, as I mentioned before. He's been targeted 8 times in he was targeted 8 times in coverage last season on passes with at least 10 air yards. So kind of, that intermediate to deep portion of the field. But that resulted in just 4 completions, 65 yards, 1 touchdown. He also had 2 pass breakups. So again, for a middle linebacker, he grades out well in that portion of the game, and I think in general, really, really effective there. At weak side linebacker, Wyoming starts redshirt junior Shea Suiau-Noah. Suiau-Noah is a guy that's just an absolute playmaker for Wyoming's defense. He's kind of all over the place. Guy that's really athletic, has a good understanding of offense. He played QB in high school. He hails from Houston, Texas, so one of these many guys on the Wyoming roster that's from Texas. Like I said, does a little bit of everything for Wyoming at LB. He's a formidable pass rusher. They like to use quickness and athleticism on different stunts, twists and delayed blitzes up the middle. Suiau-Noah effectively fights through traffic, leading hats to the football and run defense. I heard a TV announcer the other day when I was watching film that coined Suiau-Noah the garbage man. He just cleans up a ton of plays in run defense, able to get through when Wyoming is, maybe two gapping or, they have someone that's trying to spill over. Suiau-Noah is a guy that can just get hats to the football, clean up the plays. He leads the team in run stops and 3rd in run defense grade this season, also 2nd on the team in run stops last season. He leads all Wyoming LBs in pressure rate and sacks, has 1.5 sacks on the season. If there is one weakness, though, for Suiau-Noah, it's his pass coverage. He allowed 5 receptions on 5 targets for 55 yards and 15 yards after the catch this season. He occasionally struggles to identify his man in coverage and in the flats. Occasional blown assignments, missed tackles in pass defense. He had 9 missed tackles in coverage last season, led all Wyoming linebackers in that regard. Some of the backup linebackers for Wyoming, they got Cole DeMarzo and Connor Shea, 2 guys that are 3rd and 4th year players. They're serviceable. They'll rotate in occasionally. Specifically for Shea, he's played about 20-25 defensive snaps this season. He leads all backup Wyoming defenders in run stop percentage, so he can make some plays in run defense. I don't think that Wyoming's going to be rotating a whole lot. Suiau-Noah and Gibbs played pretty much all the game against Texas Tech. I think you're looking at a similar situation this weekend against Texas. Moving on to the secondary, at nickel, Wyoming starts redshirt sophomore Rook Brown. He's in his 2nd year as a starter at nickel. He's kind of the slot coverage specialist for Wyoming. He's the only one that's really taken snaps in slot coverage this season. Their safeties do a little bit, but we're talking 70 coverage snaps in the slot for Brown compared to, I think it's a combination of like 75 between their 2 safeties and all the rest of the corners. He's got 20 targets in the first 2 games in slot coverage, so definitely the most of any player on the team. He does have the 2nd lowest QBR allowed in slot coverage among Mountain West corners and nickels this season, so he does well in those situations. Brownie's a sure tackler in space, had the highest tackling grade on the team among the starting DBs last year, but he just doesn't make a huge impact on run defense, kind of a single use in that regard. Moving on to the rest of the secondary, so at cornerback, Salvo returns 3 players at corner that were like regulars or starters last season. Ja'Cory Hawkins is the returning starter. Opposite him is redshirt sophomore Colby Taylor. Taylor's the new starter this year. He did get rotational reps last year, but his first year as a full-time starter. Wyoming likes to play a lot of man and zone coverage. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but they almost had a 50-50 split between man coverage and zone coverage snaps in those coverage schemes last year. Against Texas Tech, Wyoming corners, they did give some cushion at the line of scrimmage to avoid getting burned deep, kind of keep the play in front of them. To cover Wyoming's most experienced corner, it's Ja'Cory Hawkins. I believe he's a redshirt senior. So again, another guy with a lot of snaps. He's a good technical cover corner, about 5'11", 6 feet tall. Sticks to his wide out upon release from the technique, and he's pretty sticky. He wasn't targeted much in the first 2 games. Had 19 coverage snaps per target, 2nd in the Mountain West among quarterbacks. Colby Taylor, the other cornerback opposite Hawkins, bigger, more physical, probably the most physically gifted defender that Wyoming has. He's a 6'4", 185-pound corner, so a lot of length, just limited experience. He only has around 150 defensive snaps under his belt. Again, this is his first year as a starter. The other corner to watch for Wyoming is junior transfer Tyrekus Davis. contributes in a big way at corner. He's their highest graded corner so far this season. He does a good job of keeping the play in front of him, but Davis does play a lot of soft coverage. It leads to a lot of larger gains underneath. Gives up 15.7 yards per reception, but I don't think he's allowed a reception of over 30 yards this season, at least in terms of air yards. So moving on now to safety. Wyoming has, again, 2 experienced returning starters at safety, the most productive of which is junior free safety Wyatt Eckler. He's honestly one of their most productive and experienced returning starters at any level of the defense. He's a second-year starter, but has contributed multiple years now at Wyoming. Wyoming does like to move their safeties around a lot, including Eckler. For him specifically, he will come up closer to the line of scrimmage, help out in the box from time to time, or help out in the slot. I believe it's roughly half of his defensive snaps last season were taken either in the slot or in the box, lined up pre-snap. But Eckler is a pretty versatile safety. He's good over the top when he is tested deep. Didn't allow any passes over 30 yards in coverage in the last 2 seasons. He was targeted on multiple deep balls, so it's not like it wasn't for lack of trying for the opponents. He flashed as a first-year starter last season, ranked 3rd on the team in tackles, ranked in the top half of all Mountain West safeties in defensive and coverage grades. I think just in general this season has improved pretty much all around. He looks better in coverage, better contesting space. So far this season, leads the team in run defense and tackling grade. He has 3 defensive stops, no missed tackles on the season. He's a guy that's covering a lot of ground at free safety too, so impressive numbers there. The one blemish for him this season was some of his coverage against Texas Tech. They burned him a few times. He was targeted 5 times for 5 receptions, 56 yards and a score. He responded well against Portland State, though. He had 5 targets, no receptions allowed. I believe he had a pass breakup as well. So I think for Eckler, he's someone to watch. If Texas can exploit him the way that Texas Tech did, just by getting some guys open in the short and intermediate passing game, picking up some yards after the catch, especially targeting him in the red zone. He was targeted twice there, gave up 2 catches against Tech. Then could be a long day for him. If he plays closer to what he did against Portland State, he also played pretty well against Illinois and Mizzou last season, so 2 other Power 5 opponents he's done well against. But it really depends on what version of him you get in coverage. That'll kind of set the tone for Wyoming in the defensive backfield and pass defense. Moving on, junior strong safety Isaac White, Sottle's other returning starter at the safety position this year. White, another guy that's got a lot of experience, 1,500 defensive snaps in 4 years at Wyoming. He's been a regular contributor and starter at Wyoming really since 2021. His first year as a full-time starter, though, was last season. White, again, bigger safety, 6'1", 205 pounds. Guy's just an absolute bruiser. They do use him a lot closer to the line of scrimmage to help condense the field pre-snap and really help Wyoming live up to that run, defend the run first mantra. If I could draw a comparison for White, I would say someone a little bit more similar to Anthony Cook, just in terms of he does have good closing speed. And it's a hard hitter, plays very, very physical, good at finding the ball carrier. I think the tackling issues, though, are the biggest issue for White. He's already missed 6 tackles this season, most of those coming in run defense. He's one of the worst tackling grades of any safety in the Mountain West this season. But if he does find you, if he is able to get a good read on the play, and get someone that's very quick to close and had a lot of pop in the pads. In terms of his coverage ability, average production in coverage, he ranks in the 40th percentile in coverage grade the last 2 seasons among Mountain West starting safeties. He is prone to giving up a lot of chunk plays. Had the 3rd highest boom percentage, which means he gives up a lot of explosive plays, but 3rd highest boom percentage among Mountain West starting safeties the last 2 seasons. Just a lot of that's due to kind of the poor tackling efficiency. Again, this is another situation where if Texas can find the soft spots in Wyoming's too high safety looks, especially in clear passing downs, they can do a lot of damage. All in all, for the Wyoming secondary, there's a lot of experience with this top group of 5 or 6 defensive backs. 2 upperclassmen starters at safety, both returning starters. A lot of experience between their top three corners, and then their nickel also has given them a lot of good snaps the last year and a half. But behind those guys, a lot of inexperience, a lot of all underclassmen, and no one I think that really has like more than like 25 or 50 defensive snaps. So not a lot of depth back there. If Wyoming has some injury, if they have some injury issues or if they just have to rotate, whatever that be, I think that's where they're going to get into a little bit of trouble. I think for Texas, you can attack these safeties in space. For Texas, utilize your speed, stretch the field. Wyoming hasn't been tested over the top a ton this season, and I think that's going to be a difficult challenge for them to be able to match up with some of the deep threats that Texas brings to the table, and then just the different variety of skill weapons that Texas has between guys like JT Sanders. You can get out in the flats, down the seam. You got Jordan Whittington that can work the slot between the numbers. Xavier Worthy that can go over the top, really work any part of the field, and then Adonai Mitchell that had a couple of deep ball catches last weekend against against Alabama. Let's move on now. That's pretty much all I got for the defense specifically. Again, for the format of this video, I'll kind of touch back on some key stats, analytics, things like that later. But now I want to move on to the offense for Wyoming. So Wyoming has third-year offensive coordinator Tim Polasek leading the way. He's been Wyoming's offensive coordinator and quarterback coach since the 2021 season. Before that, he was offensive line coach at Iowa for 4 seasons before joining Craig Bohl and the Wyoming staff. He's also coached under Chris Kleiman. He was the offensive coordinator and running backs coach in North Dakota State for 3 years in the mid-2010s. Polasek, he runs a pro-style offense, emphasizes a physical rushing attack. Wyoming on both sides of the ball is a run-first team, selling out to defend the run on defense and just run on offense, whether it's quarterback, running backs, or fullback. Wyoming, they're a team that's ranked in the top 20 in the FBS in the prior 2 seasons under Polasek in rushing play percentage. So a team, again, that's just a lot of running the ball. They have switched up a little bit this year, been passing the ball more often, a lot of that to keep up with Texas Tech in that overtime game they had 2 weeks ago. But specifically to their running backs, I think under Craig Bohl, I think it's 1 season where there hasn't been a Wyoming running back that ranked in the top 5 in Mountain West in rushing yards. Wyoming's had a running back rank in the top 5 in the Mountain West in rushing yards in each of the last 5 seasons. But like I said, they're passing the ball a little bit more this season, roughly 46% of plays, as compared to 36 and 38% the previous 2 years. For their most of their offensive packages, personnel looks pre-snap. They like to run a lot of heavy sets, a lot of 12 personnel. They've ranked in the top 2 in number of 12 personnel rushing attempts in the Mountain West in each of the last 3 seasons. So you're going to see a lot of 2 tight end looks. You're going to see a little bit of fullback usage. They've used the fullback, I think, more often in seasons past than they have this year, but I still think you could see a lot of fullback against Texas. Again, Polasek mostly runs zone schemes in the ground game. They didn't do a ton of guard pulling last year, doing a little bit more, roughly about a half dozen pulling plays where they pull the guards each game to start. They do line up under center a lot more often than I think a lot of teams do in this day and age of college football. A little over half of their plays on offense will be under center. So you're going to see Andrew Peasley, the quarterback, a lot that's taking snaps, again, fullback in the backfield occasionally. I'd say 22 personnel occasionally if they get really heavy, but mostly 12 personnel back there, or 21 if they're lining up with a fullback. The rushing game has been really effective for them the last few years. It's averaging over 170 rushing yards per game, over 4 yards per carry this year. That's kind of in line. Actually, I think the last 2 seasons they were even more productive than that. They've had some running back injuries this year. Again, I mentioned their running back transfer from Northern Illinois, Wiley. He's going to miss the entire season with a preseason knee injury. But they're still finding a way to run the ball. They're in the passing game averaging around 25 attempts per game this season, which is the most ever under Polasek. A lot of that due to them getting in that overtime, kind of that late shootout with Texas Tech in week 1. They had 34 passing attempts against Tech. That only went for 149 passing yards. So just because they're passing the ball more doesn't mean they're more productive in that sense, at least yardage-wise. But they are averaging 2.5 passing touchdowns per game. So once they get in the red zone, they are punching it in more, passing the ball. They do utilize a lot of 12 personnel in the passing game. It's just they like to use their tight ends in different ways. They have 2 big tight ends that can block, also flex, line up in line, and be threats in the receiving game. They ranked, again, in the top 2 in the Mountain West in 12 personnel dropbacks in each of the last 3 seasons, so they rely a lot on that personnel look. In terms of their targets to the tight end in the passing game, it's a little over 31% of the time that they target their 2 top tight ends, so a lot more than you would see out of the average FBS school. They do have this has kind of been a staple of Bowles' recruiting style and his offensive personnel. Wyoming does have a lot of bigger receivers to target, especially on the boundary. Most of their wide receivers are 6'1", 6'2", or taller. That doesn't necessarily equate to more success or more contested balls. I just think that it gives the quarterback easy targets, simple looks, big larger catch radius, things like that. Kind of minimizes the margin for error in the passing game. Their passing game is built on simple route concepts, again, getting bigger receivers and tight ends in advantageous matchups. They work a lot of the short and intermediate passing game. That's a little over half of their passing attempts this season have been in the short passing game between the numbers. I would say that that's going to be similar against Texas. They're probably going to try to test guys like David Benda. Jalen Ford, they might try to shy away from a little bit, but I think Wyoming's going to be quicker to get some of those quick 3-step, 5-step dropbacks and try to hit one of their bigger tight ends or slot receiver who they like to target a lot over the middle. They don't stretch the field a lot. They've only had 1 completion on roughly a dozen deep ball passing attempts this season that went for 29 yards and a touchdown. They are very effective in the red zone. They've scored on every single red zone possession this season. It's a little fewer than 50 FBS teams to do that this season. They've ranked in the top 50 in FBS red zone scoring percentage in each of Pulisic's 3 seasons as offensive coordinator. Andrew Peasley, their starting quarterback, can use his legs. He's able to punch it in. Again, they got a lot of targets that are good in short areas and kind of in that short window passing game. And so they got a lot of different ways they can get the job done once they got it inside the scoring area, inside that red area. So that's going to be something to watch for Texas this weekend. But in terms of their personnel on offense, Wyoming does return 5 starters, so a little bit more inexperienced, had more roster attrition, hit harder by the portal on offense than they were on defense. They're led by a 6-year quarterback, former Utah State transfer Andrew Peasley. And they lost a lot of production at some key areas this year. I mentioned that earlier. More attrition here than on the other side of the ball. Their 2 highest graded offensive linemen and their most experienced offensive tackle. So that's 3 incredibly important offensive linemen that are gone. Their leading receiver, I mentioned it earlier, Joshua Cobbs, transferred out. Lost their leading rusher as well, Titus Wen, from last season. And that kind of leaves Peasley as the heartbeat of this offense. He plays hard, runs the ball a lot, not afraid to put his head down when he needs to get some of those tough yards on key downs. He's an experienced 6-year senior. He has, I think it's like 14, 15 starts under his belt between his time at Utah State and Wyoming. I think he had 1 start at Utah State. He was the backup to Logan Bonner there for a few years. He doesn't put up crazy numbers in the passing game or the ground game. It's easy to look at how much he runs the ball and how hard he runs the ball and think that, and knowing how much Wyoming as a team likes to run it and say that, you would expect him to have 300, 500 rushing yards, but he's only had 1 season with over 1,000 passing yards. Separately, he's only had 1 season with over 300 rushing yards. That just happened to coalesce last season when he had, I think it was like 1,100 passing yards and 350 rushing yards. But this guy knows how to win. He is a winner. He's great in clutch time. He's got a 10-4 career record as a starting quarterback. I gotta say, I'm really impressed with looking at some of his clutch time numbers. He's led a half dozen 4th quarter comebacks for Wyoming in the last 2 seasons, including that Texas Tech win. And in the 4th quarter, since 2022 and OT, he's had 500 total yards, 60% completion percentage, 5 touchdowns, and no turnovers. I mean, you compare that to his overall numbers, where he's almost at it's almost like a 1.2 to 1 touchdown to interception ratio in his career. And, you can add in some rushing touchdowns there, but you can tell that he's definitely a big-time player in the fourth quarter and just when it matters in overtime. Again, Peasley's a guy that's an experienced quarterback, so he is smart with a lot of the moves he makes, but I don't think he necessarily has like the arm strength. He doesn't have overwhelming accuracy. He's not going to pick you apart, drop back there, pick you apart with his ability to throw the ball. But he does stay patient in the pocket. I'd say sometimes too patient. He was pressured on nearly 30% of dropbacks last season, which just kind of equates back to him waiting too long for the play to develop, or sometimes just not going through his progressions the way that he should be. I think when you have a quarterback that's hanging on the ball for more than 3.5-4 seconds, that's just too long. His time to throw last season, though, on dropbacks where he was pressured was over 4 seconds, which is extremely long. The time on the plays where he hung onto the ball for over 4 seconds, it resulted in 6 sacks, and he also has 1 so far this year. So if he's holding onto the ball too long against Texas, they're going to have another really productive day with the pass rush. You're going to see Peasley probably trying to escape, throw the ball away, and I think that's how you get him jostled, have him make more mistakes. I think he's at his best when he's making simple reads, getting to his first, second progression in the short and intermediate passing game, getting the ball out pretty quick. His highest QBR in any situation came on throws from in the pocket between 0 and 9 and 10 to 19 air yards, so in that short to intermediate passing game. And separately, for time to throw metrics, his highest passing grade by far is when he gets the ball out in under 3.5 seconds. Most of Peasley's rushing yards come on scramble plays. Again, he's someone that likes to run the ball a lot, but I think that a lot of times it's just him tucking and running when he wants to. Sometimes that's on key money downs, but I think sometimes that's just where he sees a gap in the defense or sees some daylight and an opportunity to make a play. For a guy like Milroe last week, you'll see him go through some of his reads and I think he gets more comfortable throwing on the run and trying to evade the pocket and get outside. I think for Peasley, again, I think sometimes he just feels like scrambling. It's not necessarily for any one particular reason. In the last since the start of last season, he's got over 300 rushing yards and 1 touchdown on scramble plays, which is well above the FBS average. I would classify him as a dual threat quarterback, but again, they don't do a whole lot of drawn up plays for him as a running quarterback. He's also picked up 12 first downs on scramble plays since the start of last season, so he can be dangerous on some of those key downs. I think for Texas, I mentioned it quite a few times already, but I think you can phase Peasley in the pocket. Texas got a good interior pass rush. But if you win the battle on the interior, you're not going to let him sit back in the pocket for that long. So you're going to have to make him make decisions. And again, he's had trouble going through some of his more complicated reads and progressions. And so I think you can get to him, get in his head early, and kind of get him to fold. He's also had some injury issues the first couple of weeks of the season. So I'll be interested to see how much contact they're willing to let him take. Let's move on to Wyoming's ground game now, specifically focusing on the running backs. Before I say it, I do want to mention Peasley is Wyoming's leading rusher this season. He's got 125 yards and a touchdown. But the second leading rusher is starting running back, redshirt sophomore Sam Scott. He's got 111 rushing yards and 1 touchdown on the season. Scott is their biggest back, bigger guy, 6'2", 230 pounds, so he can run hard, can run between the tackles. His first year as RB1 after Wyoming just lost a plethora of running backs. Again, Titus Sweaten was dismissed from the team last year. He was their 1,000-yard rusher last year, and you lost the Northern Illinois transfer to season-ending injury. They also lost another back to a season-ending injury as well, but I'll cover that a little bit later. For Scott, he's a guy that mostly runs between the tackles, but he can bounce it outside. He's got some speed to his game, but he's mostly a guy that's just big, can run through arm tackles. He is a little bit younger. He's hasn't taken a whole lot of reps he hasn't taken a ton of reps the last 2 seasons, and still developing his vision. He's not the quickest to find the gap or to find a hole and just hit it. But again, just thanks to his size and his power, he's not getting stuffed too often. He's only been stuffed 3 times this season. Has the lowest stuff rate on the team among all their running backs. But Wyoming can change the pace on. They have two other guys that are a little bit more elusive than Scott. Probably the most elusive on the team is DQ James. He's a sophomore back, smaller in stature, about 5'7", 170 pounds. They like to utilize him in different ways, get him in space in the receiving game, take advantage of some of his speed, agility, elusiveness. They also like to get him outside in the running game, mostly used on like counters, some stretch plays, outside zone run plays. Again, they mostly run with the zone run scheme. But he's a guy, if he can get to the edge, he can have some larger chunk plays once he gets out in space. He does lead the team in missed tackles forced. I believe he's in the ballpark of like 5 or 6. Yeah, 5 or 6 on the season. He just doesn't break many tackles. If you're able to, you can just really push him over just due to his smaller size. The third running back that Wyoming likes to use is Jamari Farrell. He is a junior college transfer from Mission Viejo, California. He's a guy, again, a little bit smaller. He's from Saddleback Community College in Mission Viejo, California. He's a smaller back, 5'8", 190 pounds. He's got some elusiveness, quicker than Scott, but has more power also than DQ James. Again, another good change of pace guy, kind of a combination of Farrell and James, of Scott and James. He's got a dozen carries in the first 2 games. He's had some ups and downs. He had a fumble against Tech, but scored his first touchdown in the FBS against Portland State last week. I think you could see him on the field some against Texas, but I think Wyoming's mostly going to roll with their top 2 backs, James and Scott, in this one. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but Wyoming is a team that likes to use their fullbacks a good bit. They will line up with I formation looks from time to time, or use that fullback as a leading blocker. Their starting fullback is Caleb Driscoll, guy that's I believe a junior, has over 250 run blocking snaps in his 3 years at Wyoming. He's bigger, 6'2", 245 pounds. He's reliable, tough. He's gotten better year over year. No blown blocks this season, and 12 run blocking snaps, and kind of cut down his number of blown blocks in half year over year from his freshman to sophomore campaign. They really only utilize him in run blocking sets. I don't see that he had any targets so far this season in the passing game, and I don't think he's had any rushes himself, but maybe Wyoming tries to change the tempo there. But again, he's mostly a guy that's set in one role and just kind of that hard-nosed leading blocker. Let's move on now to Wyoming's offensive line. So at right tackle, Wyoming, they got a guy that's really big and physical, they're pretty inexperienced here. They got sophomore 6'5", 305 pounder Caden Barnett. Barnett, I think he's still kind of getting his feet wet. Struggled against Texas Tech. Allowed four quarterback pressures on 44 pass blocking snaps. He did better against Portland State last weekend. Didn't allow any pressures, but again, that's against a much easier opponent. I think that for Texas, you can really pick on some of the offensive tackle issues some of the outside blocking issues that they've had early this season, and get more pressure on Peasley even from the outside. Wyoming is way more experienced and proven at offensive tackle opposite of Barnett. They got the towering 6'7", 315 pounder, and 6th-year senior Frank Crum. I believe he's been at Wyoming now since 2018. Crum is probably their most well-rounded offensive lineman, at least in terms of the proven production. He's also one of the better offensive tackles in the Mountain West. Graded out in the top half of starting offensive tackles in each of the last 3 seasons in run blocking grade. He's only allowed 2 sacks since the start of the 2022 season, none this year. So again, experienced, reliable, and pass pro. He's played well against Power 5 competitions. 2 blown blocks, no sacks allowed in the last 2 years. So that's, I believe, against 3 Power 5 teams. Crum is, I think, again, Wyoming's best and most consistent offensive lineman in most phases of the game. At right guard, this is probably Wyoming's best interior offensive line, not necessarily the most proven, but their best is sophomore right guard Jack Walsh. He's off to a good start this season. He's their highest graded starting offensive lineman. He won the job this year after kind of splitting time with junior guard Zach Watts last season. For Walsh, he's a 6'3", 310 pound Really reliable, strong interior pass blocker. He's had 430 snaps in pass pro since the start of last season. So again, even though he was splitting reps, still got a lot of work under his belt. Hasn't allowed a single sack in the last 2 seasons. He's, I believe, the only Wyoming offensive lineman that's had starter level reps during that time. They could say that. Lowest blown block percentage also of any Mountain West Conference interior offensive lineman since the start of last season. So again, I think he's got the highest upside of all these Wyoming offensive linemen, but he's just not as proven as a guy like a 6-year senior Frank Crum at offensive tackle. And then next to him at center is the 6'2", 325-pound junior center, Nafofia Tulafano, I believe is how you say it. Tulafano is in his second year as a starter at center for Wyoming. He was good in pass blocking last season, graded out among the 3 best centers in pass blocking grade in the Mountain West. He is better in pass blocking than he is run blocking, just in terms of grade and blown block percentage. But again, pretty experienced and reliable here. I'd say along the interior offensive line, not only is he Wyoming's most experienced player, but he's probably the best at getting to the second, third level as a run blocker, getting downfield as well. He did get penalized a good bit the last 2 seasons, 11 penalty calls last season and then another 2 this year. He's had quite a few false starts that were pinned on him, and then 2 holding calls, but a lot of that's not necessarily his fault. It's just he's one that gets pinned on. But he's still got some communication issues there, and to some degree you do have to fault that to the center. He's supposed to be the guy making a lot of those calls up front. Tulafano, he was picked on a good bit against Texas Tech, allowed 4 quarterback pressures, 1 sack. They were getting some good pressure from the interior offensive line. I do think, though, again, he's one of their more well-rounded, experienced guys up front. Next up, I've got redshirt freshman right guard Wes King. Wyoming is, I'd say, the most inexperienced to right guard. They got 2 redshirt freshmen that they've rotated in to start the season, the other one being Luke Sandy. Luke Sandy is kind of like their Cole Hudson, I think, up front, a guy that's taken reps at both center and guard and can rotate in either spot if need be. Both King and Sandy have taken around like 65, 70 offensive snaps to start the season. Wes King is listed as the starter on the depth chart, though. He's a lengthier, 6'5", 292-pound interior offensive lineman. Again, a guy that I think has a lot of potential, but is still refining his game and his skill set. He's still very young. He's kind of struggled with leverage, kind of like leverage at the point of attack, pad level, things like that. He's allowed at least 2 quarterback pressures in each of the first 2 games this season. Also has allowed multiple blown blocks. So again, still kind of getting his feet wet. Sandy, again, a guy that's rotated in at left guard a lot the first 2 games. Similar numbers to King, so I don't think there's one necessarily better than the other. Sandy's a little bit shorter, though, but still, I believe, under that 300-pound mark. So they're also the smallest in terms of weight at left guard, because every other position along the offensive line, they have a guy that's at least 6'2" and over 300 pounds. So let's move on now, talk about Wyoming's tight ends. And this is one of the key parts of the video, because Wyoming just uses their tight ends in so many ways in blocking and in the passing game. Again, they use their top 2 tight ends a lot. They're pretty much on the field most plays, especially in heavier sets, just given how much 12 personnel they run. Their top guy is super senior Trayton Welsh. He's most commonly utilized tight end in the passing game, mostly in line. They do motion him out to the slot occasionally. He did take 9 reps, he ran 9 routes out of the slot against Tech. But I think it's 70% or so of his snaps or of his passing snaps have been taken in line. He's an assignment sound blocker, next to no blown blocks. I think he has 1 in the last 2 seasons. He's a decent wide receiver, not a super fast guy, but sure-handed. He is kind of hard to bring down too, 6'3", 242 pounds, I believe, and so can run with a lot of power. Targeted 7 times in the first 2 games this season, mostly out of the flats and between the numbers against simpler stuff to give Peasley easy reads and throws. But kind of lacking production. I think he's like 5th on the team in receptions. The other tight end that Wyoming likes to use a lot is 6'5", 245-pound sophomore John Michael Gillenberg. He's younger than Welch. Again, Welch is a senior, so a guy that's got a lot of reps. But I think Gyllenberg is the guy with the higher ceiling. He is the more effective receiver in in the snaps that he has taken in the last 2 seasons. He's definitely a more consistent and effective receiver than he is a blocker, but he is pretty proficient doing both. He was targeted the most of the 2 tight ends in the first 2 games this season. Actually, I think he has the 3rd most targets of any Wyoming receiver. Had 8 targets, 7 catches, 59 receiving yards, and a touchdown, including a touchdown against Tech. They do like to line him out wide, motion him out more, move him around pre-snap more than they do Welsh. So I think Gyllenberg, in terms of the matchup issues, again, he's a guy that's got a lot of length. He's got good hands. He can run routes pretty well. That's definitely one to watch, just especially given how many different ways they like to use him. Moving on to wide receiver, first guy up on the list is Wyoming's leading receiver in terms of targets. That's senior slot receiver Wyatt Wayland. He's got 11 targets on the season. That's resulted in 5 catches, 86 yards, 1 touchdown. I think he's 3rd on the team in catches right now. Wyoming, they line him up a lot pre-snap out of the slot, but they do motion him around a good bit. Again, he's their most commonly targeted receiver, so they like to get him involved in different ways. I believe half of his targets he's been motioned. He moves around the field. You can move him out to the boundary on occasion. He's about 6 foot, I believe about 6'1", so he's got some height to him for a slot receiver. Definitely their most versatile wideout too. I had some drop issues last season. I had 5. I think he had the worst catch grade among Wyoming starting receivers. So that's going to be something to watch in this game if he still has those drop issues. But again, someone's going to be targeted a good bit in this game. He's probably going to be matching up quite a bit against Jahdae Barron when he's lined up out of the slot. But he's also going to see some against Terrence Brooks, some against, if they do end up trying to open up the playbook a little bit, try him in the passing or deep passing game, maybe you see some Gavin Holmes, but mostly you're going to see him against Jahdae Barron and Terrence Brooks. At field receiver, Wyoming kind of runs 2 different guys out on the field, one being senior Ryan Marquez, another one being senior transfer Ayer Asante. I mentioned Asante before. He's a Holy Cross transfer. Between him and Marquez, they each have about 4 to 5 catches on the season. Asante has been the more effective of the 2 field receivers for Wyoming this year. He leads the team in receiving yards, 96 on 6 catches. He's a guy that's been a kind of a yak monster between his time at Holy Cross and then Wyoming this year. He's leading the team and actually leading the conference in yak per catch this year with 24 yards after the catch per reception. So, he's a guy that's getting the ball close to the line of scrimmage, who can make a lot of things happen in space. I think he had 1 catch. This season to win for like 45 yak, and that's a good portion of where this yak per reception is coming from. But definitely been really effective in that part of the game. Marquez, a guy that even though he's experienced, bigger of the 2 is redshirt junior Alex Brown, 6'4", about 185 pounds. The other one is redshirt sophomore Jalen Sargent, about 6'2", I think like 190 pounds. But neither of these 2 guys are targeted all that often. I mentioned it earlier in the video. Wyoming does like to have some bigger wide receivers, but they don't necessarily utilize them a ton. I just think it's to give the quarterback easier looks. They've only had 3 targets combined in the first 2 games this season between Brown and Sargent. Brown has been the one that's more often utilized. He's got 9 in the last few seasons. He's got 9 catches for 100 yards and a touchdown. 3 of those 9 catches were contested balls. But again, I don't think they're going to play a huge role on Saturday. They haven't the last couple of years. It is worth noting, though, Brown, he's one of the many Houston area natives that Wyoming has on this team. Again, they recruit Texas pretty hard. And so the next part of this video, I want to talk about some of the matchup info, things like that. So there's quite a few game notes, like injury stuff. I also want to talk about like some of the game predictions from the analytics services, things like that. So we'll go ahead and start with injuries. So I mentioned this earlier in the video, but Andrew Peasley, Wyoming starting quarterback, he did suffer some apparent injuries in the first 2 games of the season. I believe he's listed with a shoulder injury. I've heard it reported that he had it. I wouldn't necessarily say official reports, but heard concussion thrown around. He did take some bumps and bruises, especially against Texas Tech. Seems like he did against Portland State as well. On the injury report, he is listed as questionable this weekend, so something to watch there. He's the only quarterback that Wyoming has that has attempted a single pass. Their backup is 6'5" sophomore Evan Swoboda. a big arm guy from Mesa, Arizona. He's a former teammate, a 4-star wide receiver target, Jacoby Lane. If y'all remember, Texas going after him last year. But Swoboda's got a big arm. He's a good strong runner, but he just hasn't ever attempted a collegiate pass. He's taken a few rushing attempts this year, I think, in some of their short yardage packages. So you could see him used in this game to avoid some of the contact on Peasley, but I don't necessarily think that if Wyoming has to look anywhere else but Peasley that they're going to have much of a chance in this game just from lack of experience. A few other game notes here, or a few other injury notes, excuse me. So, Wyoming does have a couple of other key injuries. They do have a wide receiver that's out for the season. Most notably, they are missing 2 running backs. Dwan McNeely was one of their leading rushers last season. He's a junior. Knocked out for the season in fall camp. Similar thing with Harrison Wiley, the Northern Illinois transfer. They're both out for the season. For Texas, I'm sure if y'all have followed this week, Sark mentioned C.J. Baxter still dealing with various injury issues. He still had some bruised up ribs, or I don't know if that was, I'd assume bruised, not broken or cracked from the first game, but still landed on the football weird when he broke off that long run against Rice. He played last week, but if you saw the broadcast late, he was kind of being helped off the field, and Sark mentioned earlier this week he's day-to-day, but we'll be monitoring for his status as it's updated closer to game time on Saturday night. The other major injury Texas is still dealing with is junior linebacker Maurice Blackwell. Blackwell suffered a knee injury kind of late in fall practice, but it sounds like he's close to getting back up to full speed. If he's not back this weekend, I believe he will be for the Big 12 opener next weekend against Baylor. Some other game notes, some things I wanted to mention that Bull said in his in his Monday press conference, excuse me. He had some really interesting things to say. I wrote up a couple of things on the site. I think the most headline or attention catching of the bunch was that he said that this is the best Texas team he's seen in 35 years as a college coach. He faced some of those really good Texas teams in the 1990s and early 2000s at Nebraska. And, he still was a college coach at North Dakota State when Texas won the national championship in 2005 and had some of those great teams in the late 2000s. I don't know if he just wasn't watching those teams or if he's just, this is just coach speak or what, but it definitely was noteworthy. Some other things that he mentioned during his press conference that I thought were interesting. One thing he said strategy-wise is that Wyoming's defense are just the way they're preparing game planning to make Quinn Ewers uncomfortable in the pocket and kind of get him outside of his zone of comfort, make his throws a little bit tougher, make it, shorten the window that he can get the ball out to all of his, just multiple skill weapons. I think that they're really going to be sticking to their identity offensively. Bull didn't really mention anything out of the ordinary. Sounds like they're going to try to pound the rock first and, maybe throw the ball a little bit. But I think the game plan might change if they can't, kind of fully run with Peasley. But we'll see on that front if his status changes closer to game time. Texas entering the game. So this being recorded Wednesday evening, so 3 days ahead of kickoff. Texas is currently a 20.5 point favorite over Wyoming. Weather forecast for the game says 70% chance of rain, cloudy, and in the low 80s. So very different weather than Texas has had. That could definitely impact things on Saturday night. I'm in Texas. I'm living here. The weather has changed a lot this week, and obviously that can impact the game plan, especially if Texas has C.J. Baxter hurt or limited in this game. And then lastly, for some of the matchup info and some of these notes I wanted to mention, the S&P Plus game prediction for this from Bill Connolly. He has 40-9 with Texas covering the spread by roughly 3 points. College Football Graphs game prediction has Texas winning 34-8. So both close to covering the spread, but both winning by at least 4 scores, kind of in that ballpark. And then to wrap up here, there's a few more sections I wanted to go through. Some of the key stats and analytics for this game. First off, I found kind of 3 stats that I think were interesting for Texas in this game and Wyoming. First one being turnover margin. So Texas has is plus 2.5 this season. They've been tremendous in terms of forcing turnovers and managing the football. They've gotten lucky here and there, landing on a couple of fumbles against Alabama. But they've gotten multiple interceptions to open the season. Had a key fumble recovery too against Rice. Wyoming, meanwhile, is -5. They're bottom 30 in the FBS in turnover margin this season. Texas is in the top 10, so completely different ends of the spectrum in that regard. Second key stat is some pass rush numbers. So Texas this season, they're obviously off to a great start with the pass rush. 21st in sack percentage in the FBS at 11.3 and 16th in pressure rate at 39.1%. Wyoming struggling a little bit more to generate an effective pass rush. They're tied for 55th in the FBS in sack rate, 7.7%, even worse in pressure rate, 116th in the FBS at 20.8%. And then the last key stat I wanted to look at, average starting field position. I think before I say this, Texas, I know that average starting field position yard line wise isn't great, but I think a lot of that is just because they've kind of gone back and forth with teams in recent weeks, but it's still worth noting. Texas is 82nd in the FBS in average starting field position. Wyoming ranks 33rd. That's not for lack of trying, because Ryan Sanborn's been awesome for Texas in the punting game the first 2 weeks. One of the highest graded punters in the Big 12. He's also the only punter in the FBS to have multiple punts down inside the 20 and one inside the 10 without any touchbacks. And then to wrap up this video, I just want to talk about kind of why I'm confident for Texas heading into this game. There's quite a few in matchup advantages that Texas has for this. That's above all else the reason why it's just at most positions Texas has the decisive edge. More specifically, though, I've kind of pinpointed some key areas where I think Texas can really win battles in this game and really run away with this game against Wyoming. First one being, I think Texas' interior defensive line, I think they're just going to be able to wreak havoc on Wyoming's a little bit smaller and more inexperienced interior offensive line. I mentioned this before, they're smallest along the interior and most inexperienced there. And so I think that's where Texas can have a lot of success with the interior pass rush and being really disruptive, getting some stuffs in the run game. I think Texas will also create a lot of problems for Wyoming's secondary with some of their speed and space. Wyoming hasn't faced a team as fast as Texas. They did get tested against Texas Tech. Tech does have a lot of weapons in the receiving core, namely Jaron Bradley, but Texas's skill weapons kind of take that to a whole other level, and now Wyoming has to face them on the road. And so I think Texas can put up a lot of numbers in the passing game on Saturday. And then lastly, I just think that, I mentioned it earlier, I think the interior defensive line has been great for Texas this year, but their run defense specifically has stymied everyone that they faced outside of some big runs from Jalen Milroe on last Saturday. But they were really good against Rice. They've had a lot of success in the first 2 weeks of the season. I don't see that changing against Wyoming. So anyway, to wrap this all up, give my score prediction for the game. I have Texas winning 38-14 over Wyoming. I think similar to the Rice game in a sense, I think Texas will throw in some of the backups and younger players at some point in the third quarter, unless this game is just really, really close. Rice kind of sold out to make that game as close as possible all throughout. You saw that with their long, 9-10 minute late drive for a touchdown that got them to double digits. But I think it's going to be a similar case with Wyoming. I think with Wyoming, the major question is just with some of the injuries they have and lack of depth at certain key position groups, can they hold up for all four quarters, even if they are selling out? Because Texas, you saw it against Rice. To some degree, you saw it against Alabama. They've got depth pretty much everywhere. So even with some of the younger guys, I think they can still outmatch Rice. But anyway, let me know how y'all think about this new video format. Like I said, this is more in-depth research-driven video. I think for the more in-depth previews is going to be the way we go from here on out. But yeah, let me know how you think about it. And then me, Tarek, and Shane will be coming back more with the panel-related discussion later this week. But anyway, for Andrew Miller, Hook'emHeadlines.com, that's pretty much it. Hook 'em.